What does sustainability look like when viewed from the lens of strategic investment? And how can CFOs align the tactics of sustainability with their broader strategies?
Today, we're talking about everything from industrial wastewater to the voluntary carbon markets, and why CFOs are now at the center of a different kind of ROI conversation.
We've got a CEO who's modernizing wastewater treatment and another who's found a way to de-risk carbon credits, all while building long-term value.
Welcome to the pre-read. Just like the slides you get before a big meeting, the pre-read prepares you, CFOs, and other executives for the next big thing. It's the global podcast where finance, sustainability, audit, and risk come together in the C-suite.
If you're making decisions at scale or need to understand the leaders who are and what they're thinking about, you're in the right place. This is the pre-read, and it's brought to you by Workiva. I'm Steve Soder, accounting enthusiast and Diet Coke aficionado.
And I'm Alyssa Zucker, sustainability nerd and equal opportunist caffeine addict. Today, we're diving into voluntary sustainability efforts. Later in the episode, you'll hear from Orianna Bretschger, CEO of Aquacycl. But first, we talked to Natalia Dorfman, CEO of Kita.
Kita is a fascinating company that insures carbon to de-risk the industry. Alyssa, can you give us a quick primer on carbon markets as our sustainability nerd and maybe how these markets are being used?
Sure. So the whole idea of a carbon market is that a company is buying a kind of attribute credit for carbon emissions that are being saved in some other process to kind of abate or mitigate their own emissions that they're not able to reduce. Now, these carbon markets are inherently risky because, of course, you, the company buying that attribute credit, that carbon emission, don't control the life cycle of the project that's kind of claiming that emissions saving or reduction. So a couple of the key takeaways from this conversation, just that carbon markets are inherently risky, but just like any other risk, they can be insured. And that kind of certainty from having an insurance product can provide confidence in financial models.
Which certainly translates to confidence for CFOs. So with that, let's get to our conversation with Natalia. So Natalia, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, what we wanted to do was just start off, what is carbon insurance? Who needs it? How does it impact the ROI for companies who are investing in carbon credits or removals? Can you just level set for us?
Carbon insurance is similar to insurance in any other industry. It is insurance that is helping to transfer risk away from a market participant, or that risk might be sitting on a company that isn't most well placed to handle it. And when somebody holds a risk that they're not well placed to handle, it's on their balance sheet and it impedes them from really utilizing that capital into other ways to grow their business. And so just like in other industries, an insurance company that specializes in carbon, such as my company, Kita, will come in, price that risk, help them structure the transaction, and then that risk will come onto our balance sheet, thus really helping free up flows of finance and helping companies within the carbon markets to grow their high-quality projects more effectively.
So much to dig into here, and I have to say I've been so excited for this conversation because I think we're talking about two fairly complex topics across carbon markets and insurance products. This is not for the wary. But you've mentioned risks, right? That's what we're doing. We're de-risking. So can you actually walk through what are some of the actual risk types that are being mitigated here?
Yeah, of course. And I should have said, we set up Kita really with the goal of reducing risk to help drive finance to scale the high quality projects that can capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So the assessment of risk and which risks there are and to what impact they can have is core to what we do. I think our view has always been that companies within the carbon market space care less about individual risks and more about the overall impact of that risk. For example, instead of caring about the fire specifically that damages the, let's say, a forestry project, they care that that fire has caused a reversal of carbon credits that have already been captured, or they care that that fire means that future carbon credits won't be delivered. And so thus our insurance policies are what you would call all risks policies, and that they're structured to cover a wide range of risks. But likewise, the sort of key sub-risks within those fall into buckets such as counterparty risk. So the risk that a counterparty, generally the one running the project, maybe acts in a way that damages the project or the investment. So they might be fraudulent, they might be negligent, they might go insolvent, they might abandon the project, or there might be some other active local destruction that damages the project. So that would be one bucket of risks. You have the political risks. So many of these projects are in countries that might be deemed high risk from the perspective of financing entities. And you have the risk of expropriation, the blocking of the carbon credits from leaving the country, war, terror, civil unrest that mean you're unable to access that project in order to maintain it. And then you have the technical and nature-based risks. So, for example, your natural catastrophe risks, your supply chain risks, your carbon modeling risks, for example, how you utilize the carbon methodology from a standard in terms of application to a specific project. And so all of these risks are one that we assess, and then we assess them within the overall structure of a transaction and how that transaction and the contractual arrangements have allocated risk to different market participants. And then the market participant we are insuring, we are transferring their risk away from them onto ourselves.
Natalia, as a former finance person, I've got to tell you, I can only imagine how complicated the pricing must be for this. An example, you had just talked about politics. So clearly investors and customers have been asking for sustainability action for a long time, but the politics has shifted completely. Presumably, the terms of these arrangements are going to span political administrations. And I'm just trying to think through, like, how do these pressures impact that? And how have they reshaped how executives and boards are thinking about this generally from an ROI standpoint on their sustainability initiatives?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm going to specifically say my answer does not relate to the wider climate change space and the wider sustainability roles and targets that companies are setting. My answer will only relate to the carbon markets. And I think the carbon markets fall into this in a relatively nuanced way. In that, like you note, carbon projects are much, much longer than the lifespan of any political administration, barring some that obviously maybe do have 20, 30 lifespans. But the majority of political administrations are much shorter than a carbon project, which goes on for 40 years. So to some extent, when companies that are interested in investing into carbon projects are assessing both the risk of political action as well as the returns they're expecting to make, I think they're looking beyond short-term political life cycles in terms of political appetite for sustainability. What they are very much looking at is what is the risk of a instability in a host country that means there is an impact upon my project that I have a loss. So for example, what is the risk of an expropriation type event? Or what is the risk of a contract frustration event? But they're less interested in the risk of what happens if a government, as we might say in the US right now, goes back on sustainability initiatives and pressures companies not to engage. That seems like it is less of a risk for carbon projects because of that long-term investment and ROI time cycle. I would also say the majority of our clients who are investing or engaging with into the carbon markets really are doing so because they're expecting a return on that investment. So increasingly, financial institutions are coming into this market, commodities traders, and certainly the project developers are doing it for a return. And so all of them are structuring these transactions to the extent possible, like you would see in wider financial markets. And they look at it on that same basis of what is the risk, how can I manage this risk, and what level of return will I get? And I think that to some extent also safeguards this from political pressures, because if you can show that any business line will make you profitable returns, that's a business line that you are going to seek to invest into and expand. And I think those are the proof points that financial institutions are looking for right now.
It's the age-old adage of follow the money. And there's certainly a lot to follow here.
And I would say, I think sometimes in the climate space that can be seen as a negative. But I think realistically, if we wish to scale up climate technologies wider than carbon, you need to show that they are profitable and they make economic sense. Otherwise, they fall into a bucket of we do it because it's the right thing to do. And that falls into a wholly different and much smaller budget than the budget that's focused on financial returns. And so I think the carbon markets are quite truly a market-based mechanism that, if it works well, deploys significant flows of capital to projects that fight climate change very effectively. And that market-based mechanism is appealing to the types of institutions that have that capital. And I think people within the climate space, I mean, obviously, this can be a controversial conversation, but I'm of the view that if you do this well, it's a very effective method to fight this macro challenge we all face.
I'm feeling a very kindred spirit in you as a climate capitalist, which is also how I would describe, my own approach with it. So there's so much activity going into the voluntary carbon market space. I mean, you look at like future valuations and projections. This is anywhere from like a 50 billion to 250 billion, market looking out to 2050. And it's become such a critical component of a company's climate strategy. But they do draw a lot of regulatory scrutiny and kind of calls for transparency just because of, the very point here, a lot of the inherent risks in carbon markets and carbon project development. So how should companies be adapting their strategies to ensure that they're staying clear as much as they can from these issues?
Well, I would say, as you would expect, that they should consider insurance. If not for them, they should consider where insurance is being applied within the transaction. So I think of within these projects, you have different buckets of stakeholders. I think what you're talking about here is really what we would call the end user, which is your corporate who has a sustainability strategy and is seeking to utilize high quality credits to offset its emissions that can't be abated by other mechanisms. These companies generally are not the ones who are taking out the insurance themselves. We increasingly see them engaging in project finance type structures where they are doing an offtake where they will pay upon delivery of the carbon credits. And their contract will stipulate that the carbon credits must meet certain quality criteria in order for them to be eligible to meet that offtake. If I was sitting in that sustainability team of that type of company and I'm thinking, well, what is the risk? I haven't put down any capital, but I still certainly have a risk I don't receive the carbon credits. And then I have a potential financial penalty of needing to go out and source replacements at a much higher cost. I might have put obligations upon the counterparties beneath me in this chain to provide me replacements or penalties or what have you. But what happens if they go insolvent or out of business, which is very possible with SMEs that are usually at the project developer level. And so what I certainly would do would be saying, where is that risk of under non-delivery being mitigated and how? Who is holding that risk? And I think you would probably start to see that actually there's an insurance company who is helping to hold that risk. But I would be asking that question.
Natalia, broadly speaking, often regulation pushes companies to improve systems and data and processes because it's compulsory. But as I'm listening to this conversation, I'm thinking about the role of insurance in being able to kind of lock in gains or lock in a financial model, candidly at some expense. But, you've sort of like eliminated or mitigated, as we've been talking about, the risks and the uncertainty. What advice or what insights could you share to help executives maybe reframe these initiatives in financial terms, kind of back to our earlier conversation about, well, Alyssa, your point about following the money. Any insights that you could share about helping executives do just that?
Yeah, definitely. All right, so I'll caveat this with it depends a bit on which industry said executive works in. So for example, if you're in financial services, you might be really thinking, how do I make this into a profitable business model for my company? So financial institution could invest into these projects on behalf of my clients and then deliver the resulting carbon credits to my clients in preset quantities. And I've created a new financial service for my global client base, right? So if I was an executive of a financial services company, I'd be starting to question, is there an opportunity here? If I was an executive of a company that is in any way required to purchase carbon credits to meet a net zero strategy, either on a voluntary basis that we've committed to, and certainly if on a regulated basis, what I would be thinking about is what kind of uncapped liability is my company accidentally taking on? In that, the price of these credits is expected to rise over coming years, but in a level that can be guessed at, but is by no means certain. And if I have committed, in essence, that I will require X number of carbon credits at future points in time, I don't actually know what those might cost. And so how can I manage that price risk so I'm not potentially putting on this, in essence, uncapped carbon liability onto my books? Depending, again, on how you seek to engage in this market, there are ways that you can cap that price risk for yourself. And again, insurance can certainly be part of it in terms of managing that delivery risk or that reversal risk that you might be concerned about. But I think once you, to some extent, take it out of the arms of the sustainability team, who clearly have a core role in setting the sustainability strategy and assessing how many carbon credits would be required to meet that unabated part of your emission profile. But once you get to that strategy and that is determined, this really should go into the hands of the finance and risk team, and they should be looking at it on that financial metric of what kind of uncapped liability might we have on our books that we could manage more effectively.
Collaboration across finance, risk, and sustainability.
Imagine that. What a concept.
Who would have thunk it? Natalia, thank you so much for this dialogue.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed being here.
88% of global professionals say AI is already driving ROI. But here's the catch. Only 1/3 have the data quality to use it well. In Workiva's latest global practitioner survey, 2,300 finance, audit, and sustainability pros shared how they're building value with AI amid uncertainty, with faster outputs, fewer manual tasks, and more strategic focus. You'll see what's working, where gaps remain, and how data integrity separates the leaders from those lagging behind. Read the full report at workiva.com/PR-building value. That's WORKIVA.com/PR-building value.
In our next interview, our colleague and sustainability expert Mark Mellon sat down with Orianna Bretschger, CEO of Aquacycl, who provides industrial wastewater treatment solutions. Alyssa, I learned that you love wastewater treatment, which is a phrase I never thought I'd say. I'm wondering, can you set the scene for us a little bit? What are we even talking about?
Steve, I do love wastewater treatment, and I can set the scene. Wastewater treatment, just for us to back up for a second, is so fascinating. I mean, this is such a critical infrastructural component of how manufacturing, municipal systems, like everything runs. And we often forget about waste. We double forget about wastewater. But basically what we're talking about here with wastewater treatment, it's something that's particularly relevant, i.e. material, to industrial and manufacturing sectors, right? They make a thing, and that production process requires water. And oftentimes it requires a lot of water. And so the production process, when you're using that water, oftentimes results in a lot of nasty stuff in it. There's a lot of waste. It could be biological, non-biological, etc. And so you have to treat that water to get all the nasty stuff out of it. And that treatment can either happen downstream at like a municipal facility and treatment plant, or it can happen on site like Aquacycl's system. And an on-site treatment approach for wastewater, as well as solid waste for the record, is generally better, air quotes, from the sustainability standpoint, because you're doing it directly on site. And so when you think about all of the downstream energy that it would take to transport the waste and treat the waste and fuel and et cetera, you get rid of all of that, especially when you think about it with wastewater, what you'd be moving, hauling across trucks or putting through pipe systems, it's mostly just water. So by treating it on site, you're really minimizing the additional kind of resources that it takes for that kind of end of life process.
Alyssa, that's very helpful. Thank you. Maybe we just need to start every sustainability conversation with explain it to me like I'm 5, because that tends to work really well for me. But Alyssa, back to Mark's conversation with Orianna, what were your key takeaways?
Yeah, so I have to say, I loved the pleasure getting to listen into this conversation, despite being pretty bummed that I didn't get to have it myself. But the 3 kind of themes that I took away from this was that for finance leaders, again, particularly in these water-exposed sectors like industrials and manufacturing, water stress isn't just a sustainability issue. It's a direct financial risk that's tied to critical business continuity. And so that really gets at the second pillar, which is about balancing risk mitigation to what is a very critical business resource, right? You can't make your product, you can't make your good without this resource. You need it to stay in optimal quality to support your production process. So it balances critical business with stewardship, and it kind of hits on 2 different kinds of risk: operational risk of your primary business line and operation, and then reputational risk of, again, being a steward of that kind of commodity or resource. And then lastly, from the business perspective, really anchoring on how to rethink the cost center of wastewater management and general sustainability, and how when you're doing those kind of ROI calculations and investment of whatever sustainability initiative, thinking about more robust and auxiliary downstream savings in addition to the direct ones. So in this example, we'll hear them talk about, again, some of that additional cost to transport the water, have a utility treat it, haul final waste outputs, et cetera. And just thinking about how to capture all of that in your financial planning and budgeting process.
Well, we alluded to this in the intro, but it would certainly be a mistake to think of these as sustainability-only conversations. So much of what I've heard in the previous conversation, as well as the one we're about to listen to, are really relevant for CFOs.
All right, so let's get to Mark's interview with Orianna.
Orianna, thanks again for being with us today. Can you give us the 30-second version of what Aquacycl does?
Absolutely. So Aquacycl developed a technology that essentially has the ability to electronically control wastewater treatment rates. It's very difficult to have a reproducible treatment result in biological systems, whether this is anaerobic conventional treatment or aerobic treatment, whether you're talking about a distributed or centralized approach. So our innovation that we bring is to really bring in that control, bring in that reproducibility, stability and reliability, and in doing this in a distributed way as well. And these are very complex wastewaters. They're highly polluted, sometimes with some pretty exotic compounds that really can challenge conventional collection and treatment systems. And so having the ability to do a point source remediation on site, which is cost effective and sustainable, is a real driver for industrial clients.
It sounds like you're working with companies where wastewater management isn't just an environmental concern, but a line item. How do you make the case to finance leaders that this is a business opportunity and not just a compliance burden?
There's business that is at risk. They've been operating in water-stressed areas. And especially, these consumer packaged goods organizations, they're very dependent on a reliable water source and then being good stewards into their community, ensuring that in order to facilitate business, they're not impacting anything else. And so one of the lowest hanging pieces of fruit is how you manage your wastewater. And the discharge, depending on what kind of packaged good we're talking about, the product rate, the product to wastewater use ratio could be 1-to-1. It could be 1-to-12. It could be 1-to-20. It could be 1-to-2, right? So that's unit of product per unit of wastewater that comes out. So if you look at that ratio, especially in those higher realms where you're 1-to-12, 1-to-20, 1-to-5, that water is good water, right? And so all you have to do is really take out the pollution and bring that water back. Or, if you do a point source remediation before discharge, whether that's to environment or to a collection system, you're enabling your community and your centralized facility, right, to work better. And you're also enabling a very natural and safe discharge if it's under an NPDES discharge permit. So there's a lot of ways to really rethink, a cost center when it comes to wastewater management and sustainability. There's so many wins associated with it.
Oh, that makes sense. That efficiency is definitely an opportunity. And I think we've used this term climate risk as financial risk in the world of sustainability more broadly. But obviously, water risk is financial risk as well. So when we think about risk and for companies under increasing pressure to meet sustainability targets and navigate tightening regulations, where does wastewater fit in that risk landscape? And how do companies balance risk with good stewardship?
Ultimately, the risk to the business is, I don't have water. I need to shut this plant down and move. And that's a massive risk, right? That's a lot of revenue lost. And that's additional capital that has to be invested to regain that revenue somewhere else. And so looking at stewardship activities and collaborative stewardship activities throughout these larger corporate initiatives, it's really all about, you can't have one without the other, right? It's if we're not being better water stewards by managing our wastewater, looking at reuse opportunities, ensuring that what we're discharging is not just adequate in volume, but also, right, really cleaner than how we got it. If they're not doing that, they're immediately putting their business at risk. And you see also in Europe a much faster changing landscape in terms of that regulatory environment, where there was the re-release of the Urban Wastewater Directive, as well as the Industrial Emissions Directive, where they both were revised and re-released, both with a much stronger focus on the polluter pays principle, in which dischargers will be directly penalized for sending something even to a collection system that a utility can't handle. even if they've been doing it for years and years and years, right? And so that's a big shift. And also some of these treatment facilities and regulatory bodies can say to the industry, nope, you just can't do it anymore. You have to do on-site treatment, or you have to have some alternative. You can't send it to us. That's a huge risk, right? And so companies that are really proactively getting ahead of this are looking at on-site treatment options, because also hauling and incineration is being limited in exactly the same capacity. So the alternatives for managing is getting slimmer and slimmer, but the innovations, right, are growing. And so it's time to really challenge the status quo and do some things differently.
I love that perspective. Again, as somebody who's passionate about the sustainability issues like water management, it's good to know that sort of that balance, there really isn't a choice in that balance as we see some of the evolution of regulation, whether it's things like emissions reductions or water consumption reduction or cost savings. What kind of metrics or KPIs are your customers most focused on, and how does Aquacycl help them track progress related to those metrics?
Yes, we track a lot of different things, but really what ultimately gets the contract signed is cost savings. So that's the number one thing that's tracked. We usually have a validation period. We're calculating what that return on investment is. In some cases, our clients are realizing an ROI in less than 12 months. So that's awesome. In addition, we're also tracking, the volumes of wastewater not hauled, right? So that's trucks not on the road. That's emissions associated with not hauling water. That's incineration that's minimized. In the case of sending to a collection system, we also track, the pounds of organic carbon that we take out of that water every single month. And if those pounds of pollution were sent to a centralized treatment facility, what would be the energy cost? Like, what does the city have to pay, and how much energy intensity do they need to apply to just treat that load, right? To that concentration. So we look at all of those equations, and especially in California, the California Energy Commission has done a great job of quantifying, okay, for every pound or kilogram of organic pollution in the water, how many kilowatt hours does it take to treat it? How many kilograms of sludge does it generate? And then it has to be landfilled. And then what are the emissions associated with that landfill application? So we take that equation, and then we track all of the kilograms of pollution that we remove and what it is that we're mitigating. So that's energy saved for the utility, which ultimately translates to emissions reduced and mitigated for that whole community, right? And so for one of our clients, we can mitigate up to 100 tons of greenhouse gas emissions every single month in one single 40-foot shipping container that otherwise would have, right, been emitted if it had to go to a collection system.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's obvious the direct costs are where the rubber hits the road when it comes to business. But it's a lot of these other costs that companies haven't accounted for in the past. Like, I didn't send a truck to take this waste material away, whether it's water or the solids that are in the water. And I think I'm really excited to see companies like yours starting to help other companies in the market navigate that sort of new frontier of sort of other costs, which companies should be keeping track of, because those are cost savings, and that matters.
Absolutely. Everywhere we can save is a good thing for all of us, right?
For CFOs or sustainability leaders trying to make their operations more resilient and future ready, where's a smart place for them to start? What should they be asking about their own infrastructure or vendors today that they might not be already doing?
It's really about, resilience, right? How do I look at my infrastructure in terms of climate adaptation and ultimately resilience, right, into the climate change that we're seeing? And 90% of climate-related disasters are water-related. It's too much water, too little water, or the water's too dirty. And so they have to look at water. Well, the incoming water, the outgoing water, ways to mitigate access, but also to improve quality across the board, whether that's in or out, right? And that plays directly into water stewardship. And so nothing functions without water. You can deal with a couple brownouts or blackouts here and there. Energy comes back, you've got some generators you can run. you cannot do anything without water. And so ensuring that their existing infrastructure can be adapted, right, to the current and future challenges that the world is facing is critical for business success.
I think that makes sense. When you think about a vision beyond compliance, how do you balance the pragmatic value, like cost savings for industrial clients, with the longer term vision for global water access and climate impact?
I think largely it comes back to that water stewardship piece of when we think about water stewardship, largely the focus has been on capacity and volume recharge, right? And the way that they do that to get to, net water positive is to actually engage in other community projects right outside of their fence line that enables a recharge event. And that is often sanitation. And so we're able to work right with our industrial clients, think through, okay, where's a community project that we can do together in an impacted basin, an area that you're working, more of a social impact type of project. And then we also get the opportunity to work in sanitation at the same time that we get to help the industrial client. And I'll add to that as well that while we haven't yet completely successfully been able to model that, we're still working on it. Because it is such an important thing for us, we do actually execute some impact projects with universities in Southern California and in Mexico, bringing water access and better water quality to communities where we can. And that's more of a fun thing that we get to do.
That's awesome. I love those examples. And you sort of alluded to it earlier too, just the ability to balance stewardship and water management. Just there won't be as much of that ability to balance. We have to do both things regardless.
Thank you again to our guests, Orianna Bretschger and Natalia Dorfman.
And thank you for listening. This has been the Pre-Read, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, sustainability, audit, and risk.
We've got more insights and hot takes coming your way, so be sure to follow or subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your edge.
And if you like the show, leave a review, send it to someone you love, or just shout it out in your next team call.
We'll be back soon. Until then, go lead it like you mean it.
I'm Steve Soder, and that was Alyssa Zucker. Segment reporting was handled by Mark Mellon. Our lead producer is Mike Gravano, with audio support from Joseph Machinsky and Drew Hayes.
Claire Allison is our graphic designer. Transcripts are created and edited by Courtney Kimsey. Thanks to our digital and social team, Mike Berg, Katie Carr, and Michael Karnowski.